Welcome to the Game Before the Money podcast, celebrating pro and college football history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Game Before the Money podcast. I'm author and oral historian Jackson Michael, and Upton Bell and I will be wrapping up the 2023 NFL season and discussing the state of the NFL through the eyes of two lifelong fans, and mostly through Upton Bell's perspective. Upton has been closely watching the NFL since the 1940s, when his father, Bert Bell, was NFL commissioner. Now, his father also founded the Philadelphia Eagles, and his innovations include overtime. Bert Bell came up with overtime, the NFL draft, and the 2-minute warning, among other things. So Upton's going to give his perception on the Super Bowl going into overtime, and also talk about where the game is at. And you get a tremendous historical perspective, as always, from Upton. Upton himself has a place in NFL history. He was director of player personnel for the Baltimore Colts under head coach Don Shula, and was still in that role for the Colts when they won Super Bowl V. Upton later served as general manager of the New England Patriots. Please remember to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com. Please sign up for the mailing list if you haven't already. Going to start this conversation with Upton talking about the Super Bowl going into overtime. To wrap up this year's NFL season, one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about was the Super Bowl going into overtime. And your father had created overtime while he was commissioner, specifically for the possibility of there being a tie at the end of a championship game.
What is interesting, Michael, is that some of the most complicated deals in life are made for the simplest reasons. And in this case, my father had proposed so many things before he even became commissioner. For instance, the merging of the Eagles and the Steelers to save teams from going out of business during the Second World War. They were called the Steagles. And he had warned the league that if they closed down and if these teams went out of business, that the league would never reopen again. And he was right about that. But he also, by the way, recommended, and ironically, we see the field goal in the Super Bowl, and the field goal that ties the sudden death game in New York. He had recommended that the league do away with the extra point and that the field goal would become, along with the touchdown, the most important thing. He wanted that part of the game to be important. He didn't want the extra point to play a role one way or another. He almost got it passed, or you would have seen today no extra point. But one or two owners said, no, they were traditionalists. Bert Bell was never really a traditionalist. He was just too far ahead of his time. So basically, he then went to the owners years later. It could have been before or during when he first became commissioner. In those days, the Chicago All-Star Game was one of the biggest games in America. The pros against the college seniors, like 100,000 people at Soldier Stadium. You've never seen anything like it. So he said to the owners, because they needed that game really promoted the NFL. He said, what happens if a championship game it ends up in a tie? Are we going to look ridiculous and flip a coin and say, oh, by the way, the Giants and the Colts tied, but the Giants won the flip? He said, we look ridiculous. So he got it passed through, and it wasn't unanimous either. So here we come to 1958, and the Giants had a storied year, coming back twice against the Browns, once in a snowstorm with Pat Summerall kicking the field goal to win the game in a driving snowstorm in New York, and then winning the playoff against the Browns the following week, 10-0. And of course, the Giants were the hero. Their defense was it. against the high-powered Baltimore Colts, Johnny Unitas, Lenny Moore, Raymond Berry. I mean, all of these, Gino Marquez, all these guys that end up in the Hall of Fame. And it would be the last game my father championship game he ever saw. And finally, they come down to the end, Unitas on this incredible drive, even by today's standards, and they end up with like 17 seconds left tying the game up. And then they go to overtime. There's so many great stories around it, but what's interesting is that the Giants players didn't know the rule. The Colts players did, but I think it was Sam Huff that said, you know what, we thought tie game, what are we doing? And then they said, come out to the middle of the field, and they explained the rules of it. But it changed pro football forever. It caught the attention of TV sets around the country. And it really brought television, even though it was in the game, but it married television and pro football. And from then on in, we have it all the way to this last Super Bowl. But there it is. I said what had happened the first time when Brady brought them back against Atlanta. I said, Burt Bell lives. 2 weeks ago, when they go to overtime, I said, Burt Bell still lives. The difference is the rules are changed. Now, I can tell you this, Michael, there are some people that prefer it, even though it might sound old-fashioned, prefer it to first score, goodbye. That's the way life is. You know, first score, goodbye. But now it's been changed so many different ways. And I'm not sure, as the 49er players said later on, they didn't know the rules. That it had been changed because of the game that I thought was the greatest football game I've ever seen, and that was 2 years before the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs, and what happened in that game, and the whole idea that Buffalo, who should have won the game, except for the stupidity of the head coach, basically never got a chance after Kansas City went down and scored in the overtime. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. But just think if Burt Bell hadn't convinced them to do that, where would we be today?
That's a lot to think about. It's only been, boy, I can't remember, and maybe you can get more an exact date, but college football didn't adopt overtime until the late 90s, early 2000s. And
I believe it was in the 90s. It was in the 90s.
Yeah, and for the longest time, there were tie games in college football. In fact, one of the most famous examples of the aspect of a tie deciding a national championship was when Nebraska played Miami in the Orange Bowl, and Tom Osborne's Nebraska Cornhuskers score a touchdown near the end of the game, and they have a chance to settle for the tie or go for two. And they went for two because Tom Osborne didn't believe that a tie should count for a national championship. But that just goes to show the difference of the having the overtime and not having the overtime, because had Coach Osborne had the opportunity to go into overtime, he almost certainly would have.
Well, look at it this way. You have baseball and you play to get a winner. You have basketball, you have a 5-minute overtime, and let's say in the NBA. That's in every game. Now, one of the things I want to go back to that I argued with in the league media, and nobody paid any attention, of course, it was my first year as general manager, when they talked about bringing sudden death to the NFL regular season. And I said, and maybe I sounded like somebody that was really old-fashioned, I said, listen, in my opinion, if a game ends up in a tie in the NFL, I know the problems that you have with tie games and where it sits in the standings. But just think about this. Overtime and playoff and championship games are what makes the NFL different than anybody else. And the whole idea that now we're going to make it just like the same thing in the regular season, I said there's a big difference there. But nobody paid any attention to what I had to say, and that's fine. The way they have it now, it's 10 minutes instead of 15 minutes in the regular season. If it ends up in a tie, it does. But my feeling is when you have something really exceptional, how big a problem is it in the regular season? Because in the end, and even the regular season, unlike the playoffs or the Super Bowl, if it ends up in a tie, it's still a tie, and it ends up that way in the standings. So it is the ultimate of all sports when you say NFL, whether it's the playoffs or the Super Bowl, and you say we're going to sudden death. There's no feeling like it. And I think my father understood that, as I did too, that this was something exceptional. Don't overdo it. Don't overthink it. Now, you wonder, let's just say, even though the present rules for the Super Bowl and playoffs are different, and San Francisco not knowing or claiming the players they didn't know, which, if true, is on the coach for not explaining it, because it was totally explained on the other side. And I know this from being in 2 Super Bowls, that everything that we needed to know about the game was explained by Shula. Every detail. So there's no excuse there. But again, think about that game. It went back and forth. To me, for 3 quarters, it was very boring from a fan standpoint. And then we got down to so many decisions that directly affected the game, particularly before overtime. And then the questionable decisions one way or another in the overtime itself. But think about this. Suppose we go to the overtime where the flip really is important. Nothing is important in this thing, even though so many people are second-guessing the coach on deciding to let Kansas City have the ball first. Shanahan might or might not have made a mistake, and then we get into analytics, which I can't stand, and I've told you before. But let's say it was the old rule. Let's take us back now to 1958. Like it or not, suppose it was the first team that scored. Can you imagine what would be going on today? Half the fans in the country would be pissed off, and the other half would say, great game. That's the whole idea of it. Now it's changed, but I take you back to when it was all or nothing at all, and I wonder what your audience would think.
You know, Shula had his team knowing all the rules. Shula had spoken about all that.
Well, the thing is that they completely, and I know everything's changed again from the first Super Bowl that I was in personally. I've seen every one either on TV in person or part of 2. One was the game that I really believe changed pro football also forever after sudden death. That was the 68 game that we lost to the Jets while being the largest favorite next to the Rams in pro football history. And going for the first time, even then, we knew all the rules. We also knew and were prepared for the onslaught of the press, for hotel rooms being screwed up or not, for the routine that was completely different from the regular season. All of that we went through. And it was even refined more in 1970 when we finally did beat the Cowboys in the Blooper Bowl. But the one thing that I can remember about Shula was he was a stickler for making sure you were prepared for everything. And that includes the rules or where they have changed, what would sudden death be, all the different things that you had to face in the game, including the most controversial decision, which was replacing Earl Morrall in the second half after he had a bad first half, although we made a lot of mistakes in the game. That will always stick out. Did he wait too long to do it?
And the interesting thing about that, this is really overlooked, and I just want to take this opportunity to bring it up, because in 1972, Bob Greasy was injured for much of the season, and Earl Morrall came in.
Right.
And the Dolphins were not moving the ball well in the first round.
Shula learned his lesson with Morrall, who was not moving the team, and went to Morrall at the beginning, I think, of the second half.
That's right. He did it. He did it at halftime. He made the change at halftime. Exactly. Yeah. That's what I was getting.
And he talked about it, went with Greasy, and they still needed a fake punt by Seipel to get things going again in the right direction. But Shula, quick to learn his lesson for not pulling Morrill at the beginning of the second half against the Jets. I believe we would have won that game. In fact, I believe that even with Unitas with the bad arm and threw one touchdown, then another one falls short because of his sore arm. But if he'd gone to Unitas, I think we would have won the game and maybe even going away.
Unitas came in and had the Colts moving almost immediately.
He did, and there was confidence and there were a lot of other things involved. But Shula learned his lesson from that game, and this time around, and Earl saved the season for them, as he did save the season for us in 1968. But Shula this time had learned his lesson and went to him at halftime and replaced him. But that's the example of being prepared. And I remember him telling me when he took the Dolphins to 3 straight Super Bowls that each year he learned more and more about the distractions of the game, the things that players have to put up with, so many of the different things that basically you needed to learn and apply. And I'm just really surprised in Shanahan, if true, that a guy like that, who's supposedly the football intellectual, didn't have his team prepared for what would take place as far as the rules as they apply to sudden death in that game. Now that again, people fall back on it, and it might be true. See, analytics, they have a big analytics department too. Pardon me, who gives a shit about analytics when you got to make a decision based on all the elements and things you know? Analytics is not going to help you. It's a dead-ass computer that spits out the probabilities. That doesn't spit out what the situation is. Down and distance, time on the clock. Is your defense tired? Is your offense tired? All of those things have nothing to do with analytics. You can do that to baseball, but not to football. I'm sorry. So,
heavily agreed. You know, we have spoken about our distaste for analytics on this show quite a bit, and it really, analytics, as we kind of talk about this past season, I think this is the first year where analytics really played a huge part in how everything turned out. And it was in a negative way. It was with the Lions losing, and people are saying that was perhaps the downfall of the 49ers as well. What is your take on that, and what is your take on the season as a whole?
We could do a show every other day on my feelings about what went on just this season. And basically, what I saw with great distaste, yelling at the television, was the complete embarrassment, in my opinion, and loss of what could be one of the great upsets in playoff history. And that's the Lions against the 49ers. I mean, the 49ers barely survived against an inexperienced Green Bay team the week before. Here's Detroit, up by 2 touchdowns, a chance to go up by 2 touchdowns on a field goal, and then a chance in the second half to continue on keeping that lead. And each time, what's the coach do? The dumbest thing I've ever seen. He uses analytics, and he goes for it each time, and each time he's unsuccessful. And then he gets his back against the wall. He's down by 3 points with a chance to tie and maybe get the momentum back, and he goes for it again. And then he goes in the locker room afterwards and said, I would have done it same way I've done it. And I'm saying, stupid is as stupid does. And I'm told that they have the largest analytics department, 27 people. Can you imagine this? 27 people. Christ, they didn't have that for the atom bomb.
And that further complicates it, because it kind of like, remember when they had those computer rankings for the BCS, and
they would have one computer ranking some random team at number 3, and then another computer would have them like way down the list. And so you wonder if some of these things are going on in large analytical departments.
As you know, the NFL, like most leagues, a copycat league, so we're going to see more and more of this. And one of the first things that the Patriots said, and by the way, I want to tell your audience, don't miss the dynasty for many reasons. That's a separate issue, because one of the things that they say in one of, and also in the press conferences of Gerard Mayo and now Elliot Wolf, is they don't have an analytics department, but they plan to beef up on it. And I said, oh, Christ, please, you got to take us back to the dark ages. But you see it everywhere, and I don't know how many real football people, although that's all changing too. The people that really do all the scouting today, I think that they're much better prepared and all of these other things. I mean, when I came in, computers and Gil Brandt were in it, and I had computers, and I had all the other stuff. But again, when Don Shula came into me and said, Upton, who do you want? I had all the reports, studies, films, everything else like that. And it's what one person was saying today on a national show. When it comes down to the end, Michael, every decision that I made was based upon a gut feeling. And you can't take that away. They're looking at these 3 quarterbacks now, and I'm listening to it ad nauseum, and all the things throwing in. Well, you know, Caleb Williams is hugging his mother and crying and all this other crap. But again, what it is, can this guy play? What is he like under pressure? What's his escapability? I don't care what he does with his mother. Can he play? And I go back to my very first time as assistant personnel director in 1964-65. Our personnel director, Keith Molesworth, had a heart attack in the middle of the draft before we picked. And Shula turned to me and said, all right, kid, you're in charge. Don't F it up. I think I was 24 years old. And I got in a big argument with him about, I said, there's a guy that plays both ways at Duke. I said, he's really a regular running back, but he also plays linebacker. Those are the days when they did. I said, his name is Mike Curtis. I said, he's ferocious, he's quick, he's smart, he's pre-med, he's crazy, he's all the things you want. And I finally convinced Shula, and he said, okay, just remember, don't screw it up. And that first draft, Mike Curtis, number 1. Ralph Neely, number 2, from Oklahoma, who played all those years and should be in the Hall of Fame for the Cowboys. But we had to trade his rights because of the war with the NFL, and he wasn't going to sign in Baltimore. He wanted to sign in Texas. Number 3, Al Atkinson, who started against us for the Jets and was one of the better linebackers in the AFL. Number 4 or 5, Marty Schottenheimer. How's that out of the gate? Does it have a damn thing to do with the computer stuff and the films? It had to do with my feeling about what I thought when I saw them.
And you know what's interesting? As you talk about this, you get a feeling as a fan sometimes about what your team should do. And you talk about yelling at the television set. There are analytics, they make you second guess your gut feelings sometimes. Another aspect of scouting and drafting that I'd like to talk to you about quickly, now that I've got it on my mind, is I recently spoke with a scout in the early 70s. He said one of the most important parts of being a scout is knowing what the coach likes in terms of player talents and abilities and what the system is. Can you kind of talk about that too? Because you and Shula knew each other well, and you must have had an innate sense of what Shula was looking for.
I certainly did, but here's the difference. And I believe in that philosophy. You have to know what your coach wants. And many people say then you have to fit it to what your coach wants. I'm going to go in the reverse. And I was lucky that if I could convince Shula this person isn't what he particularly likes, but this person could open up a new world to the way football be played, he would give me that chance. That is important. But you have to also understand another thing is, what happens if you draft these players and that coach gets fired? Now you got a new guy coming in. What does he want? I believe one of the things that Gil Brandt said that I tried to stay true to was you always draft the best athlete, the best player. If you start drafting by position, with the exception of the quarterback, which everybody now needs today because quarterback has completely changed football, is that my belief is you draft the best player that you can draft. Putting aside the quarterbacks this year that are out there and the decisions have to be made, the Patriots have the third choice. The Bears really have the top choice. But putting that aside, who's the best player in the whole draft? Marvin Harrison. So if I don't need a quarterback, I'm going to draft Marvin Harrison. He's a transcendent talent. Now, he might never prove that he could really be great, but that's the way I looked at it. So there were times when Shula and I disagreed, but he would always go back to, okay, I know where to come. It's on you. And you know what? I really didn't give a shit because I had the confidence that I had learned early. I mean, he was a 9-year-old. I could tell you about the quickness of somebody's feet, how important that was on a quarterback. How do you pass protect? I learned all those things myself. I was around the game. That doesn't mean that guarantees that I'm going to be a great scout or a general manager. It just means I have a head start. And so I believe part of the thing is you have to understand what your coach wants. And that's more so today. But you can't be intimidated by your coach. You can't put yourself in a position that you're going to change. I'll give you another example. In 1967, we end up getting the first choice. Shula traded Gary Quazzo from Baltimore to New Orleans, and sucker Tom Fears went for it and gave us the first overall pick in the draft. So I'd seen every player again and went to the game of the century, at least at the time, the famous 1966 Notre Dame, Michigan State 10-10 tie. Tie one for the Gipper. And in that game were 4 first-round draft choices from Michigan: Bubba Smith, George Webster, Clinton Jones, and Gene Washington. And with Notre Dame, they already had Kevin Hardy taken as a first-round pick in a supplementary draft, and they had all top guys in the game.
Yeah, Terry Hanratty, of course, the quarterback, was highly rated.
You have Jim Seymour. Terry Hanratty was the quarterback. Jim Seymour was the wide receiver All-American. Kevin Hardy had already been taken number 1 by the 49ers. Jim Lynch was the linebacker taken the first round by Kansas City. And, of course, the guy that I thought was better than Bubba Smith or any of them was Alan Page, who's now in the Hall of Fame. And so, Shula, we went down, interviewed all the players, because we had the first choice. We went to the Senior Bowl, everything else like that, and Shula said, I'm in love with Bubba Smith. I said, Donnie has all the talent in the world. I said, but he is so full of it, he will tell you anything. And he said, well, who do you like? And I said, I like Alan Page. He isn't as big as Bubba. I said, but the guy I love is George Webster. I said, he's a killer. He's one of the best I've ever seen in college. And so we went down, met with each player, and of course Bubba charmed Shula. And Shula said to me, well, Webster never looks at me or never says anything. I said, he's quiet. I said, till he's on the field, I said, and then he's a killer. I said, he's really amazing. And I really believe till he got hurt, he would have gone to the Hall of Fame.
That's what I was going to bring up. In the context of this, for everybody who doesn't know who George Webster is, he played maybe 3 or 4 seasons and was all pro like 3 or 4 times. He was an incredible force on the field and one of the best defensive players in the game for a couple of years until that injury.
He was Lawrence Taylor before Lawrence Taylor. He would kill you. He was quick. He was fast. He could cover. He could do everything. In the end, Shula decided, I want to take Bubba. And I said, that's fine. I said, I will say nothing publicly about it. I said, but Webster is the guy. I said, Bubba has Hall of Fame talent. I said, but he's so full of it. I said, and you're going to find that out. And in the end, Bubba was great at one thing in the light beer commercials and Police Academy. I said, that's where he belonged. And again, he would show flashes of really being a great football player, but then he would sit back and it's too bad. He never took advantage of his talent, and as a result, Alan Page became to me the greatest defensive lineman of his time, and he didn't weigh very much in the end. He was only 225 pounds. But again, it goes back to a feeling that you have about someone, and it gets to getting to know the player. Now they know too much about him. And I remember Bucko and I having discussions. Bucko Kilroy, who I hired here and belongs in the Hall of Fame himself as a head scout. Bucko used to say to me, Upton, overanalysis brings on paralysis. And he was so right. You can just overdo it. Your first thought about most things in life are really what it ends up being.
Now, what do you? There's a lot of talk both about Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. Now that there are 3 Super Bowl victories, I want to add Chris Jones to that conversation because I think he's as important. I think in this day and age, you need to have a great quarterback and you need to have a great defensive leader who is at that caliber. I think we've seen it with the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl. I think we saw it with the Rams winning the Super Bowl with Stafford and Aaron Donald. But, there's a lot of talk about Andy Reid's place all-time, Patrick Mahomes' place all-time, even though, he's probably midway through his career, if that. What are your assessments right now? And you've seen, going back to the 1940s in terms of football.
Well, I would say first ballot Hall of Famers are going to be Aaron Donald and Chris. I mean, there's no question that to me this year, Kansas City won with maybe one of the weakest teams I've ever seen go to the Super Bowl and win it. And that was based upon Chris Jones and that great defense that saved them time and again. The offense to me was, it really, in case of Mahomes, he was a miracle worker because the receivers stunk and they dropped the ball at the most inopportune times. That their running game was pretty good at times, but both he, Mahomes, and Andy Reid are a perfect team. Comes along rarely. They were meant for each other in many ways, and I think it's almost to the point now that Mahomes doesn't need anybody. That Mahomes, you can see the maturity over the years and the ability to think on his feet and the ability now to manage the game, take the sack instead of running all over the place when you need to, especially as we saw against Baltimore. But I think you will see that with other greats in the history, Paul Brown, Otto Graham, Weeb Ewbank, and Johnny Unitas. You look at, even though they're trying to tarnish his image now, and he deserves some of it. Belichick and Brady, and I think the Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes now tandem will be remembered, and that's where I think it is. I think the Mahomes, barring injury, has a chance maybe to at least tie at 6, although Brady has 7. But I think he has a chance to do that. And you got to remember that basically Brady will tell you if anybody and your audience has watched any of the Dynasty, which is really interesting and turns very dark in the end with Deflategate and Spygate and all the accusations. But I think that you will see that Mahomes does have a chance to write his own history, barring injury. And I think the thing that separates him from everybody else is he's one of the greatest athletes I've ever seen play quarterback. Allen at Buffalo, I like a lot. He's a bigger version of him. The difference is that Allen has too much a chance to throw interceptions when he shouldn't. He's so confident of himself. But Mahomes maybe is the greatest combination athlete thrower that's ever played the game. And I'm going back right into the middle 40s. I've never seen anybody that good.
Saying it like that, guys like Bart Starr, Johnny Unitas, Otto Graham, the quintessential pocket passer. Guys like Franz Harkinson, Roger Staubach, we're talking about only 2 Super Bowl victories between the two of them. Franz Harkinson, as mobile and as great as he was, never won the Super Bowl.
Let me just interject, though, and you should really add to it, though, Terry Bradshaw, who was a terrific athlete.
I didn't know how mobile he was until getting to see videos of Super Bowl X, getting to see that. I mean, he looked like a young Brett Favre to me.
But not only that, but he could run. See, I saw him in college. I saw him play. We played basketball too for a while at Louisiana Tech. I spent a lot of time down there and go over and watch him shoot in the gym. He was the first guy, to me, Tarkenton was the first to change the game. And I think that Tarkenton didn't win a couple of things that held it back. Number one, Van Brocklin, as genius as he was crazy and just wanted to beat the shit out of players. But I think Tarkenton had a few teams that should have or could have won, but they ran into the Steelers. But Bradshaw, I remember talking to Chuck Noll after he took the Steelers head coaching job, and I'm saying, Chuck, this guy can really run. I've watched him. I said, you're going to need it with that lousy offense. This is before they got all the great players. So I really look at Tarkenton, who was never hurt, as really the forerunner of all of the people you see today. Up until then, even Unitas, all of them. Unitas was one of the greatest throwers I've ever seen, but he was a pocket passer. And that's what you did. And you were told, don't get out of the pocket. Don't get hurt. I mean, you're playing in a time where people could club you to death and they wouldn't throw a flag. So there was so much there. But I say Tarkenton, Bradshaw, and they kind of then even remember Greasy before Shula went to Miami. Greasy ran all over the place. He was a guy that rolled out a lot, moved a lot, and they got killed. And then Shula, made him stay in the pocket more.
Yeah, actually, I talked to Bob Greasy about that. He said, I'm trying to remember this. It's in the Game Before the Money, the book, the exact quote, but the conversation went something like Shula telling him, you need to stay in the pocket, and Greasy saying, if you give me an offensive line where I can stay in the pocket, I will. And, then they end up getting what? Larry Little, Bob Kutzenberg, Jim Langer, and I'm forgetting a Hall of Famer or two.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. But when you look at those forerunners, I remember saying to Shula, 1963, 64, 65, because I actually saw all of Staubach's games. I said, listen, I know Unitas is in his prime and everything else like that, and we've got Derry Clauser here. I said, why not take a flyer on Staubach? I said, I love him. And Shula said, Upton, he's got 5 or 6 years. By the time he gets out of his military commitment, he's going to be 27 or 28. Well, today, that wouldn't be a problem. So he said, nah, go draft somebody else. I regret that to this day, because Dallas did the smart thing, took a chance, and of course he was incredible in college. He was incredible in the pros. He had a terrific arm. He could run. I mean, he could do everything. So we've seen the natural progression from really like the 50s through to today, and now everybody's looking for the guy because it's an RPO game, and the colleges, they think that a pocket quarterback is somebody that existed with cavemen. So you're getting athletes first and passers second. So all of that, everything is evolved from being taught the quarterback how to call your own plays. I mean, I'm saying right now to myself, does Mahomes really need Andy Reid? They become, partners in everything. But when I see these guys call every play, do you think that Brady needed a quarterback coach to call every play by the time he really matured? Do you think his last 5 years he needed somebody to call the plays for him?
Yeah, I agree. I'm thinking back in my memory bank, and one of my favorite players growing up, well, probably my favorite player growing up, was John Elway. And I remember at one point later in his career, and I don't remember if it was Reeves or Shanahan. I'm sure some of the listeners out there will remember. But one of them let him call his own plays one year, and he had one of his best seasons.
Again, you have to know how to balance all of this. But what's happened to the game is basically, and people probably saying, Bell, forget it. You're in modern times, but I know what modern times are, and I know when it can be applied or not. I mean, the Patriots had one of the smaller staffs they're now complaining about, or saying, we would need to upgrade our staff. The game's really changed. 30 coaches? You need 30 coaches? Which brings me to another point. Now, I've got 3 sets here. And on Sundays, I can watch the Patriots. I can watch the Red Zone. I can watch Fox. You name it, I can watch it ad nauseum. And I will tell you, I've been saying this for now almost 5 years. And we have now arrived at the perfect point in the NFL. Total mediocrity. Total mediocrity. A few at the top. But if you were as a fan, if you were to sit with me on Sunday and I said not a word, if you didn't come out saying it all looks the same, it is all the same. And I'm not just talking about first down, second down, third down, punt, all of the specifics of football. But just look at it. I can tell you this. Number one, the line play stinks. I mean, it's harder to find an offensive lineman than it is a quarterback. It's almost like everybody's had a lobotomy and it all looks the same. I guess that's not a danger because the one element that's still involved is the violence of the game. People love the hitting. They can say they don't. You see the slow motion tackles. You see the spectacular aerial catches. If they want the outside game and that basically the running back is obsolete, then I say, let's go to the college rule. 1 foot in. That would end all of this crap of, is his foot down? Does he have control of the ball? All of this other stuff. 1 foot in, okay? Because what we have now, Michael? We have a track meet. It's the Olympics. It's the Olympics 400 meters every Sunday. So if you're going to have that, then why not 1 foot in?
That's a good question to ask. And when you talk about track meet, there's a lot of talk, like we've kind of covered, is how is Mahomes historically? Could he play in other eras? I think he'd be a very good quarterback in other eras. But then you also, yeah. But then you also start thinking about guys. And when you start talking about track meet, what is a guy like Bob Hayes going to do in today's game? I mean,
I'll tell you what he would do. He'd have 100 touchdowns every year.
I mean, you got guys like Bob Hayes. You got guys like Alfred Denson, who was another very fast guy out of Florida A&M back in those days. And then you think of a guy like Jerry Rice in today's game. Not as fast as those guys, but Jerry Rice. And maybe what we see Tyreek Hill doing is kind of a little bit of a movie trailer of what we'd see those other guys do.
I would say, well, how about Randy Moss in his prime? Who's going to cover him?
In today's game, yes. Yeah. And I don't even consider Randy Moss. Look, I'm like everybody else. I've got my own opinions. Randy Moss was an excellent receiver. Do I think he was as good as Jerry Rice? Do I think there's any kind of, because I saw them both their whole careers. Never was there a moment where I saw Randy Moss play and thought like, oh wow, he might be as good as Jerry Rice. Now that's just my own personal.
No, and I don't think overall he would be. But the one guy that I thought was amazing, acrobatic, was Calvin Johnson of the Lions.
Yeah, Megatron was great.
He leaped over tall buildings. If you ask me who was Superman, that was Calvin Johnson. I mean, he was with lousy teams, and you can have different questions, and he is in the Hall of Fame finally. But this guy, he leaped over tall buildings. He was just acrobatic. I mean, he had everything that we're looking at. So again, we're back to where is the game going? We know the popularity, we know the propaganda, we know that now if the NFL has their way, there'll be a team in China, there'll be a team in Japan, there'll be a team in Germany. They don't care. If they can have 100 teams and get $5 billion for each team, they're going out there. But on the other hand, which I know they don't care about, is that basically, where's the talent pool coming from? How many bad teams are there? Not at bad teams. I would say there right now, out of the 32 teams, there's just about 16 mediocre teams. If you wanted to cut out at least 10 teams tomorrow, you'd be missing nothing, in my opinion. You'd be missing nothing.
Yeah, and growing up with the game, it is more difficult for some of us to kind of see this happen. And I agree with you. Back thinking about the 80s, which is really a lot of the time when I was growing up. I do remember about almost half of the 70s, not quite. But the 80s, to me, were really a golden era, and you always had a lot of very, very good teams who were going to compete. I mean, the Giants, Washington, the 49ers, the Bears, all in the NFC. Those were all excellent teams, and the Cowboys. And, really, those teams would run roughshod over most of the NFL right now.
Absolutely. And again, I keep saying again, but but I don't want in any shape or form for people to think that I live in the past. I am all for now. I love every minute of it. But I'm telling you, the realistic part of Upton Bell says it ain't as good. But it doesn't make any difference because, at least so far, the fans love it. So, and good for the players, even though their average life is only 3 to 3.5 years still. Dallas might have to pay their quarterback $50 million. I say, you know what? Good for him. I don't think he's a great quarterback, but good for him. $50 million.
Yeah. I'm always on the side of the players as far as making the money that they can, because, like you said, the average career is 3 to 3.5 years. You know, there are always going to be repercussions of playing in the NFL throughout the rest of your life, even if you do play only 3 years.
Michael, I can't tell you how many players, including the first player I ever drafted, Mike Curtis, we talked about earlier in the interview. He died not knowing who he was. I had one of the last conversations with him, and it was one of the few times I put the phone down. I was in tears. And the great thing about youth is you never think about being older. That's why young men are sent to war. That's why young men get into football. You know, they love the challenge of it. They don't mind the violence of it. They understand. Most football players understand that what they're doing is extremely dangerous work, and one blow and you could be out of it. And yet, that's what youth does. But if you could see many of them in their older life, a lot of them can't walk. They have mental problems. There are all sorts of things. So that I say good for them, because how many owners really love you when you can't play anymore? Not many.
You know, again, just to kind of wrap it up, again, like you, I'm going to keep watching the NFL, even though I pine for the younger days. I still watch on Sundays. I still enjoy the game. I still love watching Patrick Mahomes. I really enjoy the possibility of some of these players on the Houston Texans, like C.J. Stroud, Tank Dell. I got to see him play a game in college, and he was great. So really looking forward to seeing, hopefully, how his NFL career unfolds in Houston. And there's always a part of me that's still cheering for Dak Prescott to turn things around and win the big game.
Not as long as Mike McCarthy is the coach and Jerry Jones is the owner. I think Houston has a better chance. And by the way, I love Stroud. I think he's going to be a tremendous quarterback. That, by the way, as you're wrapping it up, is the excitement about, because I've seen the first players coming in. I saw, even as a little boy, my father's team, Davey O'Brien coming in. In fact, there's a picture of my brother as a mascot for the team when he was like 4 or 5. I mean, from the Davey O'Briens to the Strouds to the Mahomes, those type of things give me the thrill and give me the feeling that I still love football. But I am not naive enough to know that so many things have changed, some for the better, and others remain the same. And that's the only way you can look at it. If you love something, and I said at the end of my book, don't think just because I'm critical that I don't love the NFL. It's just, you have to be honest. And the things that we see we don't like, and the things that we see we do like. And the game is still the thing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Game Before the Money podcast. Please visit thegamebeforethemoney.com Remember, the Game Before the Money is a 501c3 nonprofit. You can make a donation at thegamebeforethemoney.com. Transcriptions of some episodes of the Game Before the Money podcast are also available at thegamebeforethemoney.com and are powered by our transcription partner, Sonix. Sonix. Visit sonix.ai to learn more about their automated transcription services.